Hi, in this chapter, we are going to study the dynamics of locomotion. Locomotion here means walking and running. I think this is maybe the most interested chapter that most of the students who is taking this course, who are working in robotics or the human locomotions. So this is very interesting chapter. So I hope that you will enjoy this. The overall contents of the course is composed by the two dynamics chapter and one control chapter. So dynamics are pretty much the force and motion relationships, like equations of motion, how those forces are generating the motion of human walking and running or other motions. And in control part, we are going to study how those motions are sensed and processed at the brain, and how those control input is generated and sent to the actuator, the biological actuator to the muscle, so that the muscle can generate the forces and torques. Specifically for the dynamic of locomotion, we are going to study about the solution methods and inverted pendulum model for walking, the typical traditional walking model. And recently, the spring model has been getting many focus attention. So we are going to also introduce a spring-based model for walking and running. So first, I'm going to start with introducing solution methods. Solution methods, the reason that I specifically made it as a um, explicit chapter is because the walking has a specific solution steps compared to the other analysis like a human posture control balance analysis, because it's bipedality and periodicity. That's what I'm going to introduce. So first, I'm going to briefly introduce what are the steps for modeling and simulation for walking. And the rimless wheel is going to be a really good simple example to explore all those solution methodology. And we're going to also study about how we can analyze a periodic solution finding and check their stability. Before I start, I'm going to briefly introduce the terminology we are going to have so often in this chapter. So suppose that I have a right leg colored as a yellow and the left leg colored as a green. This is a stance phase. When I have a ground contact and support my body weight, that's the stance phase. So this yellow one here is a stance leg, and the other leg, which is moving through the air from back and forth, that's what we call the swing leg. If I switch to the step to the left leg, the green colored one, so here the green colored leg is a stance leg and the yellow one is a swing leg. And at the point of right hand side, like a right leg, the yellow leg, this is a mid stance and this is a mid swing phase. And this stance phase actually start with by striking the heels to the ground, so what we call as a heel strike phase, heel strike moment, whenever those leg hit to the ground. And then when the leg leaves the ground, its ankle actually pushes the ground off. So this is what we call the push-up moment. Okay. And if we are only looking at, since the walking is kind of periodic motion, we usually present the single stance phase for the data representation and just assuming that this actually happens periodic manner. So for example, from the heel strike and up to the point where the other leg's heel strike, that's a single stance phase. So out of total like a time rate for the single stance phase, we just draw maybe the gait related parameters like a center of mass or the ground reaction force plot with the x-axis as a single stance phase percentage instead of usually just simple time axis. And whenever I have two legs on the ground, that's called a double support phase, where I only have a one leg on the contact with the ground, that's called the single support phase. If I switch to the stance leg as a green one, the left leg, this is the single stance phase. And the first part is going to be the double support phase with both legs on the ground. And only single leg means a single support phase. And when we call the step, that means from left leg to the left leg or the right leg to the right leg, from the very end to the very end, the heel strike part or any other reference point. And from one leg to the other, that's what we call the stride. So two strides are going to be one step. Okay. Okay, so why do we model human walking? Well, my personal answer is it's gonna be help to actually for you to understand the data. When we do the gait analysis, there are so many measurement data like knee angle of the right leg, knee ankle or thigh angle of the right leg and the left leg, or even your arm moves back and forth. So you will have a bunch of data set. But are those data sets are independent with each other? Well, no, because those are really linked through the body. Okay, body has a really great constraints so that your wrist motion is not has some things to do with the elbow angle and with the shoulder angle as well. So dynamics, actually the force and motion relationship or kinematics, are explaining how those data are related in terms of forces or in terms of joint kinematic constraints. So instead of just simply looking at the data and figure that out what are the factors that correlate with each other, you can actually understand the phenomena deeper with using those mechanics. So I'd like to say that maybe the understanding, maybe the modeling and simulating the walking and the locomotion will help you to coordinate the data, organize data, and understand the data deeper. Okay, but note that even though your model will really well represent the human data, you are not supposed to directly, infer that, oh, it really happens biological manner. No, I mean, physiologically, it's a really complicated system. Many sensory informations and process at the central nervous systems are involved for the human walking. So your modeling is just simple mechanical representation of what really happens, what's happening between the force and motion at the exterior part. But what inside your body is may or may not be, coherent to your model approaches. So note that your mechanical analysis cannot be directly inferred right away in a physiological or biological mechanism interpretation. And what is a good model? So whenever I study about human motion biomechanics modeling, some might say, well, real human have a 7 segments and your biological model would have only 2 or 3 segments. So isn't that too simple or something? Well, how complicated it should be your model to represent the human motion. That's basically depending on what gait characteristics, what motion characteristics you want to represent through your model. Someone might just want to show the torque and proportional relationship between the torque and the angle, or some might want to explain the complicated mechanical energy involved for faster walking. Depending on what you want to examine, that's the decision criteria should lie, how complicated or how simple your model can be. So for example, if you want to show your gait periodicity, like a periodic gait existence, or something like a dynamic relationship between the force and motion, GRF, and the center of mass, or how your step length's getting larger and larger as you walk faster. I mean, depending on what kind of gait parameters or gait characteristics you want to examine, that depends on how simple your model could be and how well developed your model is. So if your model can well represent those relationships you want to examine, even though it's pretty simple, I think that's pretty good model. And how even though your models are pretty complicated, those model cannot really demonstrate what really happens for the human walking, then I think your model should be revised. Okay, the final question is, can human walking be explained by simple dynamics or control model? Well, that's what we should examine. Human movement controls are involved very, very complicated nervous systems involved mechanisms. For example, when you move, your motions are sensed by motion sensors such as a vision vestibular system or the muscle spindles. And those multisensory signals are sent to your brain, like your cerebellum or cerebral cortex. And there are very complicated sensory processing is occurred, and then the control command through the muscles are sent to your joint muscles, and so that your joint could actually generate the torque. So it's a pretty complicated structure. People want to, make an analogy. Oh, this looks like a very simple feedback control algorithm that typical engineering students learn at their undergrads. Like, for example, you have a plant, and those plant output sensors are sensed by the sensors, and those error sense signals are compared with the reference. So the errors are fed into the controller, so the controller will generate the actuation signal so that the plant could be actuated. So as far as when we have a plant as a human body motion, this could be a possible biological control model that could explain human upright posture control, right? And the good thing, also the good thing for the math is if you are only focusing on the input and output relationship, such as a transfer function, okay, like a second order transfer function or the first order transfer function, up to that after that point, I mean, it doesn't really care is that coming from mechanical system or electrical system or biological system. So if we are succeeded and successful for making reasonable good transfer function between input and output for the musculoskeletal system, or sensors like stimulus versus the sensory afferent signal to the brain, or some control output efferent signals from the muscles. As far as those are well represented by good reasonable transfer function, the next step is just mathematical formulation. So that's how the typical engineering disciplines and approaches could be merged into biological system or biomechanical system to understand human motion and human walking, etc. So for the human walking, okay, so there are pretty like many joints are involved, right? So when you actually hit the ground, you bend your knees and your swing leg actually move forward and hit the ground again. There's a step transition occur. It's pretty complicated. So there are many joint forces are involved here. Can you specify them? Okay, or it's going to be pretty tough control problem. Luckily, there was a researcher who actually proposed that maybe we don't need this complex controller to make the bipedal system walk, make a periodic gait. So that's what we call the passive gait. Passive means like there's no actuation, right? So without those sensing and actuation, maybe the dynamics itself, like F equals MA itself, might be able to represent some typical gait characteristic, walking characteristic. That's what we call the passive dynamic walking a concept. That's what we are going to examine in this chapter. So there are many passive walking analysis has been gone through so far last decades. So that's what we are going to learn in this chapter. The good thing for this simple passive walker is it's simple so that it's easy to analyze so that you can get more basic concept for the walking characteristics. Of course, the drawbacks are because it's too simple. It's quite different from what actual human walk or bipedal robot walks. But it's gonna provide a good, really good, simple theoretical framework. Okay, so walking compared to the just posture control or other motion has a specific step, which is a step-to-step transition. It switches the leg, right? It switches the leg with the ground contact. So it actually involves a collision, right? So how does this collision problem could be solved? Look back your dynamic courses, what you have learned in your undergrad. So whenever their collision happened, what did you do? Yes, you actually apply the impulse momentum relationship, impulse momentum conservation, or a coefficient of restitution kind of thing is what you have done, what you have used for the collision analysis, right? So that's what we are going to do to analyze a human walking as well for the step-to-step transition phase, and how the energy should be handled because you keep losing the energy during the collision. That's what we are going to actually work on using a simple passive walking model using the gravity as energy source. That's what we are going to cover in this chapter. Okay, so if I summarized the solution steps ahead, how you can solve the human walking or running. First, the very first step is you should obtain the equations of motion, typically like a robotic equation, like a mass matrix and the acceleration, actuation part and the velocity part and the gravity part. And to make the system simple, maybe we can only focusing on the center of mass, the single mass problem, and then putting those two legs massless. Okay, and to make the equation even simpler, maybe let's say there's no actuation, so it's pretty passive walking. And then whenever energy is needed, we are going to use a simple gravity as an energy source. That's a concept for the passive dynamic walker. Okay, the very first step is you should obtain the equations of motion for the stance phase. Stance phase means when your leg is have a contact with the ground, and you're going to integrate those equations of motion up to the collision part before you actually switch the step from left leg to the right leg, or leading leg and the trailing leg, okay, or the blue leg and the green leg here. And at the impact, as I mentioned before, we are going to apply the impulse momentum relationship. By doing so, I can actually swap the two legs, okay? Since there is a step to step has been transition occurs, that's why we are going to apply the impulse momentum relationship during collision phase. Once I actually switch the leg, then what happened? Actually, I'm actually coming back to the original equations of motion, like a new step starts, right? So I'm going to repeat this process over and over until I actually find the feasible periodic gait. That's the basic steps for the solutions for walking simulation. Sorry, which I'm going to explain more in detail later. And the question is, can this step guarantee periodic gait or even stable gait? In 1992, the Ted McGeer actually mathematically and experimentally showed that without control in a 100% passive manner, you can generate periodic and stable gait solutions. So that's what we are going to work on in this chapter. So this is Ted McGeer showing the passive dynamic walker. So there's no motor, nothing, only aluminum rigid body structure, and it actually walks downhill pretty well, the periodic manner. So that's what we are going to study. So after his proposal for the passive dynamic walking concept, there are many other variety of bipedal walking model, like a legged mess with bipedal walking model with the masses, or the knee joints, or the curvy foot, sorry, and or 3D model has been developed. And then we are going to work on about very simple cases like a rimless wheel in the next slide.